Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Lizzo and Billy Porter are learning what a lot of bootlicks have to find out the hard way. They are utterly dependent on white power for every crumb of their daily bread, and the moment white power cuts them off, they're done. Lizzo has lost her would-be reputation, such as it was, and now she's lost her Super Bowl gig. Billy Porter, on the other hand, recently lost his white husband in a divorce. There were serious questions about which one of them would get the house, but as it turns out, neither one of them, because Billy Porter's losing the house too. And the same white media who made these two into a thing isn't shedding a tear for either one of them, or giving them so much as a single sympathetic word on their behalf. Why is that? There was a phrase that I coined: when white supremacy is done with its tool, it breaks its tool. Now, the reason that I came up with that saying was because I've looked at what white supremacist regimes and Eurocentric regimes in general have done throughout history since ancient times. When the Romans went into what today is called Britain and they colonized it, they didn't just beat up the locals and declare themselves boss. That's a bad idea because it makes it where you'll have to fight a protracted insurgency. What you gotta do is you gotta politically confuse the people that you're trying to dominate. If you want to dial people in to be oppressed for the long haul, then you simply have to confuse their internal politics, and that means you have to recruit a certain number of the people you're oppressing to work against their own group. There has always been a strong element of complicity whenever you find any sort of oppression going on. So the Romans began running around and selecting certain people from the British tribes to be their tools. One of them was a prominent local family who willingly served the interests of the Romans. The Romans had slave provinces and free provinces in Britain, just like the slave states and free states in the U.S. This local family I was alluding to was in one of the free provinces, that is, until one day the provincial governor realized these people were lazy and declared that the free province was now a slave province. The Romans knew that the locals wouldn't like hearing that, so they decided to preemptively respond to the expected outrage by making an example out of one of them. But they didn't just choose to do it to anyone. The Romans selected the very prominent family who had collaborated with them in their occupation. This would become the story of Boudica and her daughters, who the Romans publicly whipped and raped. Boudica would afterwards lead a slave uprising, which ultimately ended in failure. Now, eventually, the Roman Empire collapsed, and the centurions and all the rest of the Roman nobles left, and the people of Britain, or rather their tribal chieftains, would start calling themselves kings, and copy the Romans' example. These English monarchs went north into what would become Scotland, and they began doing the same thing the Romans had done in England, beating up on the Scots, declaring themselves boss. But they also chose certain select families in Scotland to be their tools in their political oppression of their own white northern neighbors. Now, there was one well-to-do family who had gone along with this occupation until one day they had a male heir who decided he didn't want to take orders from the English anymore, so he led his own revolt in Scotland against the English, which ultimately ended in his death. That man, you've probably already guessed, was William Wallace. I'm sure you remember him from the Mel Gibson flick Braveheart. Now, in the movie Braveheart, Mel Gibson invented a fictional version of Wallace, portraying him as being the dirt-poor son of a dirt-poor sharecropper and getting beat up on by the king's knights. But in reality, William Wallace was a child of the Scottish aristocracy. His father was a nobleman, a knight in fact, and so was William Wallace. Now, in the movie Braveheart, Mel Gibson is in his 30s, but in reality, William Wallace was in his early 20s. How was a man that young able to raise an army? Because he came from a prominent family, one who, like Boudica before them, had actually been more than content to go along with the occupiers, but like most tools who the oppressors give the illusion of having authority, the tools began to think of themselves as being on the same level as their oppressors. But they're not. During the 1930s, the Nazis were rounding up the Jews. In order to facilitate this, the Nazis selected a group of Jews to be their tools. These people would be called the Judenrat. The Judenrat were so-called local councils of Jewish leaders who were selected by the Nazis for the purpose of carrying out the Germans' policies toward the Jews in this or that enclave. The Judenrat were given the authority to have their own Jewish police operating in their areas, but of course, the only people who the Judenrat's police were allowed to exercise any authority over were other Jews. Something that doesn't get talked about is that many of the so-called capos often used brutal violence and killings to make sure that the other Jews didn't get a line. That's what the Judenrat would often do. You had Jews who were rounding up, brutalizing, and even killing other Jews on behalf of the Germans. And what happened to the Judenrat when the Nazis had rounded up the Jews and sent them off to the death camps? They told the Judenrat to go to the death camps right along with them. When their tools had served their purpose, they broke their tools. Now, there's plenty of other examples that I can name, but I think the point is made. The Europeans have a long history of taking people from among those who they oppress and then sending these hand-picked tools back among their own people to control them. Either it's done as violent opposition, as with the Judenrat, or they send people in to tell their own people that the oppressor isn't so bad. Why, if the rest of you would just go along with the program, they would treat you as well as they're treating us. Black celebrities are the main ones who we see doing this. They love to tell themselves how smart they think they are, that they have white power figured out, and if the rest of us would just get in line, as Tiffany Cross said, then massa would treat us better too. By the way, anyone seen Tiffany Cross lately? Whatever happened to her MSNBC show? I'm just asking for a friend. Now, why does white power make it a point to assiduously break their tools? Why are they so adamant about making sure they do that? Because, as the Romans and later the European colonizers found out, if you fail to break your tool, eventually the tool will become a weapon against you. Spartacus was a good example of that. Boudica was also another. In Haiti, you had the mulattoes, many of whom remained loyal to the French, but a lot of them, including Toussaint Louverture, turned on them. And in the U.S., you had the same. Nat Turner was a good little preacher man for those white slave owners, right up until the moment he wasn't. As long as white supremacists have been using tools to expedite their oppression of other groups, they've also seen that at some point the tool must be broken, or it or its children will inevitably turn on their oppressors, and they won't even be doing it because they suddenly decided that oppression is bad. In many cases, the tools break bad simply because they want to be in charge. Tools have to be frequently reminded of their place, and a large part of that is to show them how quickly they can lose everything if they don't toe the line for white power, if they displease their masters even in the slightest. Everything gets taken away. Hell, you don't even have to displease massa. The tools need to be reminded frequently that if massa so much as has his grip on power slip just a little bit, it's going to be the tools who suffer first and the most. By the way, a number of our so-called freedom fighters have also been tools of white power. One of the ways the white power has shown its sophistication against us is that it confuses the oppressed by conning them, or rather tricking them into conning themselves, into thinking that the system can be changed to benefit them solely by using only the methods approved of by their oppressors. This is why voting alone won't change our condition. Notice the wording I use for the hardheads out there. I didn't say voting absolutely cannot work under any circumstances. I said that voting alone won't change our condition. That's the reason why we have to have a code of conduct, and that code of conduct has to be internally enforced. But for the sake of argument, even if voting alone could change our condition, it certainly can't do it if the only things we have to vote on are candidates and policies put in front of us by white supremacy. This is what I mean when I keep telling you that we have to force the system to do things it wasn't designed to do. It was not designed to put people on the ballot who were going to tear down white supremacy, or to put policies on the ballot that were going to destroy the system of goodies, giveaways, and guarantees that so much of the dominant society is utterly dependent on. This system was designed to perpetuate and protect anti-black racism. Every candidate and every policy these white supremacists put on the ballot are there solely to serve that purpose. Well, in 2020, we showed how you can influence policy without a ballot. No elections, no new candidates, no new laws, and yet in 2020 you suddenly had DAs charging these police and putting the scumbags in prison. Practically all the black politicians and these so-called activists are nothing more than controlled opposition, tools of white power. They want you to cheer for them when they get elected to office, or to cheer and march for them or their slogans at their rallies, but all of them were chosen by, funded by, and given power by the same forces that oppress us. So when you see Lizzo getting dragged by the same white media that encouraged and praised her asinine behavior, keep in mind, this is all part of the same old cycle that the tools always go through. It's like I've often told you, white power absolutely loves a cruel prank, especially one that takes a long time to pay off. And there's no joke as cruel or as long as pretending to be someone's friend. When the tool finds out that their buddies hated them from the very beginning, and that they spent years yucking it up with and trading barbs about the black community with people who couldn't even stand them, when they can no longer avoid having to accept that they had spent years living a lie, it crushes them. And it also leaves them with nowhere to go afterwards. The black community's not going to take them in. Just ask Stacey Dash. White supremacists savor that. The complete and thorough destruction of someone who hadn't even done anything against them. They savor every moment of that. The idea that they crushed this tool not because the tool had displeased them, but simply because they could. They especially love the part when the mark thought that they had buddies. These white supremacists will gladly encourage them to do stupid stuff, and when black people call them out on it, the white media will run interference for them and say that it's harmless fun, or you just got some people who are just hating. Tools love that part. It's a self-reinforcing mechanism. When the white media uses its enormous reach to carpet bomb the public with propaganda glorifying Lizzo showing her behind at a Lakers game, oh, that's just some flamboyant fun. She's just a bold trendsetter. Oh, what a boss move. The bootlicks love that. They love the adoration from the white media. It makes them feel like they're on the team, as if they're honorary members of the oppressor class, as if they have now been bestowed with the gift of whiteness because they think they're receiving the exact same special dispensation from criticism that you get all these white celebrities and white politicians and white social figures receiving. That's why Lizzo felt so emboldened and eager to tell black people to kiss her behind, something she would never do to white audiences. But now those same white media types are dogging her out. And as for Billy Porter, he spent years playing the fool for white power too, being their slap-happy, skirt-wearing example of a castrated black man. He went and married a zaddy, but that didn't last long, and now Porter says he's lost his home due to the actors' strike. Now, the unions are supposed to have funds set up to try to help members in cases like this, but let's be honest, those are actually only for the white members. And those so-called funds don't really have much in them to begin with. They're more for paying bills, small things, but certainly not paying people's mortgages. The same people who egged Billy Porter on when he was making a fool of himself on the red carpet and elsewhere are nowhere to be found now. Bootlicks are given just enough pennies from white power so that they can fake styling and profiling for the cameras. But in reality, none of them is making as much as they want people to believe. See, that's part of being in the white media, being part of their fraud. You have to project power, project success. Perception is reality. Problem is, reality always gets the last word. And the reality is the white media is not black people's friends. And that includes the tools and bootlicks. The people skinning and grinning with one of them one week will be turning their backs on them and criticizing them the next. Michael O'Hare thought that the Tuohys were his friend, but not anymore. I don't include him in this list, though, because he wasn't attacking the black community to the best of my knowledge. His offense was criminal naivete, but I blame his parents for that more than I blame him. He trusted the wrong people because he was allowed to. Well, being a tool, wittingly or not, is something we can't allow. I have no sympathy for these two-bit bootlicks. The only reason they're even slightly contrite now is because white power is cutting them off, letting them swing in the wind. But let things go back to normal and they'll go right back to doubling down on attacking us. After all, the only tool that a tool has is kissing white powers behind. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Zachary Hayes, Maurice Soul, Wesley Monroe, Suleiman Alaji, and Jeffrey Williams. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.